Captain Tessa Nova's starship is attacked by an unknown alien force, leaving her the sole survivor on a hostile alien world. She encounters a wounded alien warrior named Zalcor and decides to help him, despite the risks. Part 2, as Tessa works to heal Zalcor, an unlikely bond forms between them. She learns more about his people, the Vayashi, and their ongoing war against the ruthless Krelak invaders. Zalcor is initially distrustful, but comes to admire Tessa's compassion and resilience. Part 3, Tessa and Zalcor set out across the dangerous alien landscape to reach a Vayashi stronghold. Along the way, they face threats from hostile wildlife and Krelak patrols. Tessa's human ingenuity and skills prove vital to their survival, earning Zalcor's deepening respect. Part 4, upon reaching the Vayashi base, Tessa leverages her engineering knowledge to help them repair and improve their defenses against the technologically superior Krelak. As she works closely with Zalcor and his people, powerful feelings develop between them. Part 5, in a climactic battle, Tessa and Zalcor fight side by side to defend the Vayashi from a massive Krelak assault. Tessa's quick thinking and self-sacrifice turn the tide, but leave her gravely wounded. In the aftermath, the Vayashi welcome Tessa as one of their own, while she and Zalcor look forward to a future together. Here is part 1 of the story. Part 1, a fateful encounter. The wail of warning alarms jolted Captain Tessa Nova awake. She leapt from her bunk, years of training taking over as she dashed to the bridge of her single-seat scout ship. The deck shuddered beneath her feet, they were under attack. Tessa's hands flew over the controls, trying to evade the incoming fire. The unknown assailants had appeared out of nowhere, catching her completely off guard in the unmapped star system. Computer, damage report. Tessa barked, banking hard to port. The evasive maneuver came too late. An energy blast slammed into the hull, sending cascades of sparks raining down on Tessa as consoles overloaded. Hull breach in Section 12. Propulsion systems offline. Life support failing, the ship's AI reported, its normally calm voice distorted and glitching. Atmosphere venting. Total systems failure imminent. Tessa suppressed a surge of fear. The alien ship loomed on the view screen, its angular, predatory shape unlike anything she'd encountered before. More blasts hammered her crippled vessel, and she knew with cold certainty her scout ship could not survive another hit. Gritting her teeth, Tessa wrenched the control stick, sending the ship hurtling towards the blue-green world filling the forward viewport. If she could reach the atmosphere, perhaps she could use the planet's gravity to slingshot around, buying time to restore propulsion and escape. The ship shook violently as it plunged into the upper atmosphere, hull temperature spiking. Tessa fought with the stick, trying to maintain control as the ship bucked and jutted around her. The pursuing alien vessel broke off as her scout ship streaked through the sky like a wounded bird struggling to fly. Warnings blared and flashed, the cacophony filling Tessa's helmet. The hull temperature climbed past critical levels. Massive damage to all systems. Planetary impact in 30 seconds. Immediate evacuation protocol advised, the AI warned, its voice stuttering and fading. Tessa wrenched her harness free and staggered to the escape pod as the ship started to come apart around her, atmosphere howling through widening breaches. Explosions chased her through the disintegrating companionway. With a final desperate lunge, Tessa hurled herself into the escape pod and slapped the emergency launch control. The acceleration slammed her back into the seat as the escape pod blasted free of the dying ship. Moments later, a tremendous explosion lit the sky as her scout ship broke apart. The shock wave tumbled the tiny pod, and Tessa nearly blacked out from the G-forces battering her body. As the pod stabilized, Tessa caught a glimpse of scintillating azure seas and emerald continents, a deceptively beautiful vista. She had no idea what world this was, no way of knowing if the atmosphere was even breathable for her. The pod shook violently as it knifed into the thickening air, leaving a trail of ionized particles in its wake. The outer hull temperature soared as friction turned the pod into a blazing meteor. Groaning from the pressure, Tessa wrestled with the barely responsive controls to slow her descent. Abruptly, the pod lurched and tumbled, a loud bang reverberating through the tiny capsule. The main chute had deployed, but instead of slowing her fall, the pod began to spin wildly, the chute tangled and only partially unfurled. Tessa swore, bracing herself as the ground rushed up to meet her. The impact was tremendous, a teeth-rattling crash that sent waves of agony through Tessa's body. For a long moment, she lay dazed, her vision graying at the edges as she struggled to remain conscious. The air smelled of burnt insulation and hot metal, and warning lights flashed weakly on the broken control panel. With a titanic effort, Tessa hit the emergency release for the hatch. It blew outward with a hiss of hydraulics and a gust of alien air that sent Tessa reeling. Struggling out of the crash webbing, she pulled herself hand over hand through the hatchway, collapsing onto the rich purple vegetation as her abused body finally gave out. Unconsciousness dragged at Tessa, black flowers blooming in her vision as shock set in. In the instant before awareness fled, Tessa glimpsed movement in the dense foliage, a suggestion of a tall, humanoid figure. Then the darkness claimed her. Tessa swam up slowly from the depths of unconsciousness, her head pounding in her mouth as dry as Martian dust. She blinked against the too bright light filtering down through a canopy of lavender leaves. The air was heavy with the sweet, unfamiliar scent of alien flowers. Memory came rushing back, the attack, her desperate planetfall, the crash. Tessa sat up abruptly, then hissed in pain as her body protested the sudden movement. She was bruised and battered but, miraculously, nothing seemed to be broken. The crash site was a tangle of broken vegetation and still smoldering wreckage, the escape pod crumpled and half buried in the soft, loamy soil. It was a miracle Tessa had survived at all. A rustling in the undergrowth sent a spike of adrenaline surging through her veins. Tessa staggered to her feet, reaching instinctively for a weapon she didn't have. "Who's there?" she called, wincing at the ragged sound of her own voice. The foliage parted, and Tessa found herself face to face with an alien being. It was humanoid, but taller than any human Tessa had ever seen, with long, muscular limbs and dusky blue skin. Bioluminescent patterns swirled across its skin, pulsing gently in mesmerizing whirls and spirals. Most striking of all were its eyes, large, almond-shaped, and a brilliant, pupilless silver that seemed to glow from within. They regarded Tessa with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The alien was clearly wounded, one arm hanging limp at its side, the flesh scored with deep, cauterized gashes. It held its other arm out in front of it, a gesture that seemed half warning, half supplication. Tessa raised her own hand slowly, trying to show she was no threat. "I'm Captain Tessa Nova of the Earth ship Serendipity," she said, keeping her voice soft and steady. "I mean you no harm." The alien cocked its head, trilling a series of liquid syllables that Tessa's universal translator struggled to interpret. "You are not." "Krelak," it said haltingly, the words heavily accented but understandable. Tessa shook her head. "I don't know who the Krelak are. I'm human, from a planet called Earth. My ship was attacked, and I crashed here." The alien seemed to consider this, the patterns on its skin shifting and swirling in agitation. "I am Zalcor," it said at last. "You are on Vyashi world." It took a step forward, then stumbled, a low keen of pain escaping its throat. Without thinking, Tessa stepped forward to catch Zalcor as he fell. Up close, she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the thrum of his heartbeat beneath her hands. His blood was a startling shade of luminescent purple, staining Tessa's fingers where they pressed against his wound. In that moment, any thought of fear or mistrust evaporated. Zalcor was a sentient being in need of help, and Tessa's duty was clear. "It's okay," she murmured, easing him down to sit on a fallen log. "I'm going to help you." She had no way of knowing if her medical training would be of any use on an alien physiology, but she had to try. Ripping strips of fabric from her flight suit to use as makeshift bandages, Tessa set to work, determined to do whatever she could to save this alien who, like her, seemed very much alone on this strange, uncharted world. As she worked, Tessa couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a chance encounter. On a planet of millions, what were the odds she would crash so close to another wounded soul? Perhaps, she mused, there was some greater purpose at work here, some design as yet unclear. For now, though, all that mattered was the life in her hands, the fragile thread of connection spun across the void between stars. Whatever happened next, Tessa knew her life would never be the same. For better or worse, her fate was now intertwined with Zalkor's, tied together by the slender threads of compassion and chance. With gentle hands and determined spirit, Tessa set about the task of healing, ready to face whatever challenges this alien world, and her unexpected companion, might bring. Bonds forged in adversity. Tessa worked diligently to clean and dress Zalkor's wounds, using supplies salvaged from her escape pod's emergency medkit. The Vayashi warrior watched her with those uncanny silver eyes, his expression unreadable but intent. As she applied a salve to a particularly nasty gash, Zalkor flinched, a low hiss escaping through clenched teeth. Tessa paused, concern etching her features. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know it hurts, but this will help prevent infection." Zalkor trilled a response, the translator implant struggling to convey the nuances of his alien language. "Pain is a warrior's companion," he said at last. "I am grateful for your aid, Tessa Nova." Tessa couldn't help but smile at the formality of his address. "Please, just call me Tessa," she said as she finished bandaging the wound. "And I'm glad I can help. We're both in a tough situation here." Zalkor inclined his head, the patterns on his skin shifting in what Tessa was starting to interpret as a gesture of respect. "You are a skilled healer," he observed. "Are all humans trained in such arts?" Tessa shook her head, packing away the medkit. "No, not all. I had medical training as part of my starship captain's education. We're expected to be prepared for any eventuality out here." Zalkor considered this, absently tracing one of the swirling patterns on his uninjured arm. "Your people are explorers?" he asked, curiosity coloring his tone. Tessa nodded, settling herself more comfortably on the log beside him. "We are. We've been venturing out into the stars for a few generations now, seeking knowledge, forming alliances, trying to understand our place in the universe." She couldn't keep a note of wistfulness from her voice. Out here, crash-landed on an unknown world, the grand adventure of human space exploration seemed very far away. Zalkor must have sensed her melancholy, for he leaned forward, his uninjured hand coming to rest lightly on Tessa's arm. The contact sent a slight tingle through her skin, a not unpleasant sensation. "You are far from your home," he said softly, understanding resonant in his voice. "As am I. My scouting party was ambushed by Krelak raiders. I alone survived." Tessa's heart clenched at the sorrow in Zalkor's tone. She could only imagine the pain of such a loss, the weight of being the sole survivor. Impulsively, she covered Zalkor's hand with her own, offering what comfort she could. "I'm so sorry, Zalkor. I can't imagine how difficult that must be." She paused, hesitating, then plunged ahead. "Who are the Krelak? Why did they attack you?" Zalkor's eyes darkened, the silver dimming to a stormy gray. "The Krelak are invaders," he said, his voice low and intense. "They came to our world a generation ago, seeking to conquer and enslave. We have been fighting them ever since." He looked down at their joined hands, his larger blue one engulfing Tessa's smaller pink one. "They are ruthless, merciless. They see other sentient beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited. The Vayashi will never submit to such tyranny." In that moment, Tessa felt a surge of kinship with Zalkor and his people. The Vayashi sounded not unlike humans, proud, defiant in the face of oppression, unwilling to bend the knee to those who would subjugate them. Humans have faced similar threats, she found herself saying. Both from without and within. The struggle for freedom, for self-determination, it seems to be a universal constant. Zalcor met her gaze, and in his eyes, Tessa saw a reflection of the same fire that had driven humans to the stars, the unquenchable spirit that refused to be broken by hardship or adversity. Then perhaps, Zalcor said slowly, humans and Vayashi are not so different after all. Tessa smiled, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Perhaps not, she agreed. We're both here, aren't we? Both survivors, against all odds. Zalcor returned her smile, and for a moment, the gulf between their species seemed to vanish, bridged by a shared understanding, a mutual recognition of the indomitable nature of sentient life. The moment stretched, pregnant with unspoken understanding, until Zalcor reluctantly pulled his hand away. We should move, he said, his tone businesslike once again. The Kree-Lak will be searching for survivors. We are not safe here. Tessa nodded, standing up and offering Zalcor a hand. He took it, allowing her to help him to his feet. Where will we go? She asked, scanning the alien forest that surrounded them. There is a Vayashi stronghold, a day's journey from here, Zalcor replied, testing his injured arm gingerly. If we can reach it, we will find shelter and aid. Tessa took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. A day's journey through unknown territory, with an injured companion, hunted by hostile aliens, it was a daunting prospect. But Tessa had never been one to shy away from a challenge. Lead the way, she said, gesturing towards the dense foliage. I've got your back. Zalcor nodded, a glimmer of respect in his silver eyes. And I, yours, he replied formally. Together, we may yet survive this. Side by side, the human starship captain and the Vayashi warrior set off into the alien wilderness, their fates now inextricably intertwined. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, forging an alliance born of necessity and nurtured by mutual respect. The jungle closed in around them, vibrant and alien, full of untold dangers and possibilities. Tessa felt a thrill of excitement mingled with trepidation. This was the very essence of exploration, the heart of what had drawn her to the stars, the chance to discover, to learn, to connect with the vast, pulsing web of life that spanned the cosmos. As she followed Zalcor deeper into the unknown, Tessa couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just another mission. This was the beginning of something profound, a journey that would test her skills, her courage, and her very understanding of what it meant to be human in a universe full of wonders. With each step, she could feel the bonds between herself and Zalcor growing stronger, two disparate threads weaving together into a tapestry of shared purpose and mutual reliance. Whatever the future held, Tessa knew she would never be the same. And somehow, that thought brought more excitement than fear. The alien sun dappled the forest floor with shades of lavender and gold as the unlikely pair ventured forth, ready to confront whatever challenges this strange new world had in store. The journey had only just begun. Perils and revelations. The alien jungle was a symphony of strange sensations, a riot of colors and sounds that assaulted Tessa's senses as she and Zalcor forged their way through the dense undergrowth. The air was heavy with the sweet, cloying scent of unfamiliar flowers, and the cries of unseen creatures echoed through the twilight gloom. Zalcor moved with the sure-footed grace of one born to this environment, his movements fluid and silent despite his injury. Tessa, in contrast, felt clumsy and loud, every snapped twig and rustled leaf a beacon announcing her presence. They had been walking for hours, stopping only briefly to rest and tend to Zalcor's wounds. The Vayashi stronghold, he assured Tessa, was not much further. But the terrain was treacherous, and the ever-present threat of Kree-Lak patrols hung over them like a pall. As they crested a rise, Zalcor suddenly froze, his hand shooting out to halt Tessa in her tracks. She opened her mouth to ask what was wrong, but a sharp gesture from Zalcor silenced her. He pointed, and Tessa followed his gaze to see a group of figures moving through the foliage below. Even from this distance, Tessa could tell they were not Vayashi. Their armor was a dull, metallic gray, and they moved with a brutish, lumbering gait. Krelak, she realized with a surge of fear. Zalkor's hand dropped to the hilt of his energy blade, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the patrol's movements. Tessa's heart pounded in her chest. She was unarmed, her survival kit lost in the wreckage of her escape pod. If it came to a fight, she would be all but useless. For a tense moment, it seemed the Krelak would pass by without incident. But then, one of them paused, its head swiveling towards the rise where Tessa and Zalkor stood. It let out a guttural cry, pointing in their direction. "Run," Zalkor hissed, giving Tessa a shove. "I will hold them off." But Tessa shook her head stubbornly, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. "I'm not leaving you," she insisted. Zalkor opened his mouth to argue, but there was no time. The Krelak were charging up the hill, their energy weapons glowing with malevolent light. Zalkor shoved Tessa behind him, his blade leaping into his hand, the air around it shimmering with heat. The first Krelak to reach them fell to Zalkor's blade, the smell of seared flesh filling the air. But there were too many, and Zalkor was already wounded. Tessa watched in horror as a blast from a Krelak weapon caught him in the side, sending him stumbling. Without thinking, Tessa snatched up a fallen branch, bringing it down hard on the head of the nearest Krelak. It crumpled, but another was already taking its place, its clawed hand reaching for her throat. Tessa closed her eyes, bracing for the end. But the blow never came. Instead, there was a flash of brilliant silver light, and the Krelak let out a scream of agony. Tessa's eyes flew open to see Zalkor standing over her, his blade buried in the Krelak's chest. He pulled the blade free, the patterns on his skin pulsing with exertion and pain. Around them lay the bodies of the Krelak patrol, felled by Zalkor's skill and ferocity. Tessa scrambled to her feet, her heart in her throat. "Zalkor," she breathed, reaching for him. "You're hurt." But Zalkor shook his head, waving off her concern even as he swayed on his feet. "We must keep moving," he insisted. "More will come." Tessa wanted to argue, to insist that he rest, that she tend to his wounds. But the look in his eyes brooked no argument. Wordlessly, she nodded, falling into step beside him as they began to run. They ran until Tessa's lungs burned and her legs trembled, the jungle a blur around them. When at last they stopped, collapsing at the base of a giant, twisted tree, Tessa was certain they must have put miles between themselves and the site of the battle. Zalkor leaned heavily against the tree trunk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The wound in his side was bleeding again, the bandages soaked through with luminescent purple blood. Tessa knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she peeled away the bandages. The wound was deep, the flesh around it blackened and blistered. Tessa swallowed hard, fear and worry a tight knot in her chest. "Zalkor," she said softly, "this is bad. You need more than just field dressings. You need real medical attention." Zalkor shook his head, his eyes fever-bright in the gloom. "The stronghold," he insisted. "We are close. I can make it." Tessa bit her lip, torn. Every instinct screamed at her to find shelter, to tend to Zalkor's wounds. But she knew he was right. They couldn't stay here. "Okay," she said at last. "Okay. But you lean on me, you hear? Don't you dare collapse on me." A ghost of a smile touched Zalkor's lips. Captain," he murmured, the words a faint echo of humor despite the pain in his voice. Tessa helped him to his feet, slinging his uninjured arm across her shoulders. He was heavy, his body radiating heat like a furnace, but Tessa gritted her teeth and bore his weight. Together, they stumbled onwards, Zalkor guiding them with terse, whispered instructions. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows deepening until Tessa could barely see the hand in front of her face. But just as despair began to take hold, just as she began to fear they were hopelessly lost, the foliage ahead parted to reveal a shimmering energy barrier, beyond which Tessa could see the gleaming spires of Ayashi architecture. The stronghold, Zalcor breathed, relief and exhaustion mingling in his voice. We made it. As they approached the barrier, Zalcor raised a trembling hand, the patterns on his skin pulsing in a complex sequence. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a low hum, a section of the barrier deactivated, forming a doorway just large enough for them to pass through. Tessa hardly had a moment to marvel at the technology before Vieyashi warriors were swarming around them, their voices raised in alarm and concern. They took Zalcor from her arms, bearing him swiftly towards the largest of the buildings. Tessa made to follow, but a firm hand on her arm held her back. She turned to see a tall, regal-looking Vieyashi, the patterns on their skin more complex and intricate than any Tessa had yet seen. They were staring at Tessa with an intensity that made her want to squirm. You are the human, they said, their voice a melodious alto. The one who saved Zalcor. Tessa nodded, suddenly unsure. How much did the Vieyashi know of her presence? Would they welcome her aid, or view her with suspicion? I am Kesli, leader of this stronghold, the Vieyashi continued. You have done us a great service, human. Zalcor is a hero among our people, a symbol of our resistance. His loss would have been a grave blow. Tessa inclined her head respectfully. I only did what was right, she said. Zalcor saved my life as much as I saved his. I owe him a debt. Kesli studied her for a long moment, silver eyes unblinking. Then, to Tessa's surprise, they smiled, the patterns on their skin rippling with warmth. Then it seems, they said, that you and I have much to discuss, Tessa Nova of Earth. Come, let us tend to your own hurts, and then we shall speak of debts, and of the future. With a gentle hand on Tessa's back, Kesli guided her into the stronghold, the energy barrier shimmering back into place behind them. Despite her exhaustion, despite her worry for Zalcor, Tessa felt a thrill of anticipation. Here, among the Vieyashi, she sensed that her journey was truly beginning. What role she would play in the battles to come, only time would tell. But one thing Tessa knew for certain, her life would never be the same. And for the first time since crashing on this alien world, that thought brought more excitement than fear. Alliances and affections. In the days that followed, Tessa found herself immersed in the life of the Vieyashi stronghold. As she recovered from her own injuries, she spent long hours with Kesli and the other Vieyashi leaders, learning about their culture, their history, and their ongoing struggle against the Krelak. She was fascinated by their technology, which seemed to blend the biological and the mechanical in ways that challenged her understanding of what was possible. The Vieyashi used living materials in their construction, coaxing trees and plants to grow into the shapes of buildings and tools. Their energy weapons were grown, not manufactured, each one uniquely bonded to its wielder. But it was the Vieyashi themselves who truly captured Tessa's interest. The more she learned about them, the more she came to admire their courage, their resilience, and their fierce determination to protect their way of life. She spent much of her time with Zalcor, who was recovering from his wounds under the care of the stronghold's healers. As his strength returned, he insisted on giving Tessa lessons in Vieyashi combat techniques, claiming that she had proven herself a warrior and deserved to learn. Tessa found herself looking forward to these sessions, not just for the skills she was acquiring, but for the chance to spend time with Zalcor. There was a bond growing between them, a connection that went beyond mere friendship or alliance. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, admiring the play of light on his skin, the fluid grace of his movements. And sometimes, she caught him watching her too, his silver eyes intense and unreadable. It all came to a head one evening, as they sat together in the stronghold's garden, a place of otherworldly beauty where bioluminescent flowers bloomed and strange, melodious insect songs filled the air. Zalcor was telling her a story of his childhood, of his first hunt and the pride in his father's eyes when he brought down his first Krasha beast. Tessa listened, enraptured, marveling at the glimpse into a life so alien and yet so achingly familiar. As the story ended, Tessa found herself leaning closer to Zalcor, her hand coming to rest on his arm. You're an amazing person, Zalcor, she said softly. I'm so glad I crashed on this planet, if only because it meant I got to meet you. Zalcor looked at her, his eyes glowing softly in the twilight. I feel the same, he said, his voice a low rumble. You have brought light into my life, Tessa Nova, in a time of great darkness. Almost without realizing it, Tessa found herself leaning in, her lips brushing against Zalcor's in a soft, tentative kiss. For a moment, Zalcor was still, and Tessa feared she had overstepped. But then he was kissing her back, his hand coming up to cradle her face, his touch gentle despite the strength she knew lay in those hands. They lost themselves in each other, the world falling away until there was nothing but the two of them, human and Vayashi, bound by something deeper than mere biology. When they finally parted, Tessa was breathless, her heart racing in her chest. That was. She started, but Zalcor silenced her with a finger on her lips. Shoo, he murmured. Do not question it. Let it be what it is. Tessa nodded, leaning her forehead against his. In that moment, the future seemed full of possibility, a canvas waiting to be painted in bold, bright strokes. But their moment of peace was short-lived. A klaxon split the air, the sound harsh and urgent. Zalcor was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to his weapon. The alarm, he said, his voice tense. Something's wrong. Tessa was up and running before he finished speaking, following him as he sprinted towards the central command. They burst in to find Kesley and the other leaders gathered around a holographic display, their faces grim. What's happening? Zalcor demanded. Kesley looked up, their expression somber. Our scouts have reported a massive Krelak force approaching, they said. Larger than anything we've seen before. They'll be at our gates within a day. Tessa felt a chill run down her spine. She'd seen the Krelak's brutality firsthand. The thought of them descending on this place, on these people who had become so dear to her, it was unbearable. What can we do? She asked, stepping forward. There must be a way to stop them. Kesley shook their head. Our defenses are strong, but against a force of that size. I fear it will not be enough. Tessa clenched her fists, a burning determination rising in her chest. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't. These were her people now, as much as any human. She would fight for them, die for them if she had to. What about the energy shield? She asked, her mind racing. If we could boost its power, make it impenetrable. Impossible, one of the other leaders said. We don't have the technology. But Tessa was already moving, her eyes fixed on the schematics of the stronghold's defenses. Maybe you don't, she said, but I might. Let me see your power systems. If I can integrate some of the tech from my escape pod, I might be able to give us the edge we need. Kesley hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Do it, they said. Take whatever resources you need. Tessa nodded, her mind already racing with calculations and possibilities. She turned to Zalcor, found him watching her with a mix of admiration and concern. I'll need your help, she said. This isn't going to be easy. Zalcor's answering smile was fierce and proud. You shall have it, he said simply. Now and always. Side by side, they raced out of the command center, ready to face the impossible. The fate of the stronghold, of the Vayashi, perhaps of this entire world, rested on their shoulders. But Tessa had never been one to shy away from a challenge. With Zalcor by her side, with the strength of the Vayashi behind her, she felt like she could face anything. Sacrifice and triumph. The Krelak attack came with the dawn, a wave of armored figures pouring out of the jungle like a swarm of deadly insects. Their weapons flashed in the early morning light, searing beams of energy that scorched the earth and set the very air ablaze. Tessa stood on the stronghold's walls, Zalcor at her side, watching as the horde approached. Despite their tireless efforts over the past day and night, she knew their defenses were not as strong as they needed to be. The modifications she'd made to the energy shield would help, but against a force this size. She glanced at Zalcor, saw the grim determination in his eyes. He met her gaze, his hand finding hers and squeezing briefly. In that touch was a promise, an acknowledgement of all that lay between them, and all that might never be. Then the Krelak were upon them, and there was no more time for thought. The battle was joined, a cacophony of screams and explosions, of searing light and shattering stone. Tessa lost herself in the rhythm of combat, her newly honed skills put to the ultimate test. She and Zalcor fought side by side, a seamless unit, each anticipating the other's moves as if they shared one mind. Around them, the Vayashi warriors battled with a ferocity that belied their peaceful nature, their energy weapons leaving trails of ghostly light in the dawn's growing illumination. But for all their bravery, all their skill, it wasn't enough. The Krelak kept coming, an endless tide of brutality and hatred. They breached the outer walls, then the inner courtyards. The fighting turned to desperate hand-to-hand combat in the narrow streets and hallways of the stronghold. Tessa found herself separated from Zalcor, cut off and surrounded. She fought with a desperate fury, but she knew it was only a matter of time. A Krelak blade found its mark, slicing through her armor, leaving a trail of fire along her ribs. She stumbled, fell to one knee. And then Zalcor was there, a whirlwind of silver light, his blade singing a song of defiance. He stood over her, protecting her, a beacon of hope in the chaos. But even he could not stand forever. A Krelak energy bolt found its mark, burning through his armor, sending him crashing to the ground beside Tessa. She crawled to him, cradling his head in her lap, heedless of the battle that still raged around them. Zalcor, she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't leave me. His eyes fluttered open, fixing on her face with an intensity that took her breath away. Never, he breathed. In this life or the next, I am with you always. Tessa felt a sob tear its way out of her throat. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't lose him, not now, not like this. And then, through the haze of grief and pain, an idea came to her. A desperate, reckless idea, born of desperation and a love she hadn't even fully acknowledged until this moment. The energy shield. The modifications she'd made. If she could get to the power core, if she could overload it. It would mean the destruction of the stronghold. It would mean the end of everything they'd fought for. But it would also mean the end of the Krelak, the end of their threat to this world and all others. It would mean a chance, however slim, for the Vayashi to survive. For Zalcor to survive. Tessa looked down at Zalcor, saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. Tessa, he whispered. No. But Tessa was already moving, lurching to her feet, ignoring the pain that screamed through every nerve. I have to, she said, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. It's the only way. She bent, pressed a fierce, desperate kiss to Zalcor's lips. I love you, she whispered. Always remember that. Then she was running, dodging energy blasts and falling rubble, her focus narrowed to a single point. The power core. She had to reach the power core. It seemed to take an eternity, but finally, she was there. The core pulsed with barely restrained energy, the modifications she'd made glowing with an ominous light. Tessa hesitated for only a moment, her hand hovering over the control panel. She thought of Zalcor, of Kesli, of all the Vayashi who had become her family. She thought of Earth, of the home she'd left behind, of the mission that had brought her to this moment. Then, with a whispered prayer to whatever gods might be listening, she slammed her hand down on the control. The world went white. A searing, blinding light that consumed everything, that tore at the very fabric of reality. Tessa felt herself falling, her body disintegrating, her consciousness unraveling. Her last thought, before the light claimed her, was of Zalcor. Of his smile, his touch, the way he'd looked at her in the garden under the alien stars. I'm sorry, she whispered into the void. I love you. Then there was nothing. Awareness returned slowly, in fragments and snatches. The soft beep of medical equipment. The murmur of voices. A warm, gentle hand holding hers. Tessa opened her eyes, wincing at the brightness of the light. She was lying in a bed, in a room she didn't recognize. And beside her. Zalcor, she whispered, her voice rough and hoarse. He was there, his face etched with worry and relief, his silver eyes bright with unshed tears. Tessa, he breathed. You're awake. Tessa tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. What happened? She managed. The Krelak. Gone, Zalcor said. Your plan worked. The overload destroyed the stronghold, but it took the Krelak with it. Those that survived fled back to their ships. We're safe. Tessa felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed closely by confusion. But, how am I alive? I thought. Zalcor's grip on her hand tightened. I found you in the rubble, he said softly. You were barely breathing. The healers didn't think you would make it. But I never lost hope. Tessa felt tears sting her eyes. You saved me, she whispered. Zalcor shook his head. No, Tessa Nova. You saved us. You saved all of us. He leaned down, resting his forehead against hers in a gesture that Tessa had come to recognize as the Vayashi equivalent of a kiss. Rest now, he murmured. You're safe. I'm here. Tessa let her eyes drift closed, let the warmth of Zalcor's presence wash over her. There would be time later for questions, for plans, for figuring out what came next. For now, it was enough to know that they had won. That they were alive, and together, and that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The human and the Vayashi, the warrior and the scientist, the two souls who had found each other across the vastness of space and forged a bond unbreakable.